Part 1. The Man Who Saw Mountains Differently. The Mistral wind swept through Aix-en-Provence like an invisible hand tearing at the shutters, rattling the tiled roofs and bending the cypress trees toward the earth. In the distance, Mont Saint-Victor loomed against the horizon, not merely a mountain but a sentinel, a silent witness to centuries of human struggle. That evening in the winter of 1860, a young man stood before it with paint-stained fingers, staring so long and hard it was as if he wanted to pull its soul through his eyes and trap it forever in color. His name was Paul Cézanne. To the villagers he was a strange one, moody, restless, slow to speak, quick to anger. He was not handsome, nor charming, nor rich in the way people thought mattered. But there was something in him, a stubborn, unyielding hunger to see the world differently. And for Cézanne that mountain was more than rock. It was an answer to a question he could not yet put into words. He had been born here in Aix in 1839, the son of a strict banker and a gentle mother who saw something rare in her boy. His father, Louis-Auguste Cézanne, had built his fortune brick by brick, and he expected his son to do the same with law. But young Paul did not dream in contracts and numbers. He dreamed in light. He dreamed in shadows that breathed in colors that trembled like music. At school he met a boy who would shape his life as deeply as the mountain, Émile Zola. Zola was loud, confident, and full of ideas, and he treated Paul not as the awkward son of a banker but as an equal, perhaps even a genius. They roamed the countryside, chasing stories, debating books, swimming in the Arc River until their skin turned pale blue from the cold. Zola would later write about him, sometimes with love, sometimes with cruelty. But in those early years they were brothers of the spirit. Yet Cézanne's father would not hear of art. Painting was a pastime for aristocrats with nothing better to do, not a profession for his only son. So Paul was sent to law school in Aix, where the lectures suffocated him like damp wool. Each day he sat in the dusty lecture halls, his fingers twitching as if they still clutched a brush. At night, he sketched secretly, hiding the papers from his father as though they were weapons. But the call grew louder. Paris, that was where artists lived, where light took on 1,000 faces and never slept. In 1861, Paul convinced his father to let him attend the Académie Suisse in Paris, on the pretense of trying painting before committing to law. It was in the cramped, smoky rooms of the Academy that Cézanne first tasted the fire that would consume him, the world of the avant-garde. He met Camille Pissarro, Claude Monet, and other young rebels who spoke of painting not as imitation but as revolution. They painted outdoors, chasing the fleeting moments of sun on water, the breath of clouds, the truth of shadows. But Paris was not gentle to Cézanne. The critics tore his early works apart, calling them vulgar, violent, unfinished. His thick, trembling brushstrokes were not refined. His colors were unsettling. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something inside him hardened. If they wanted polite, he would give them the opposite. If they wanted beauty, he would give them truth, raw, unflinching, eternal. One evening, as the gas lamps flickered in the Paris streets and the smell of coal smoke mingled with roasting chestnuts, Cézanne stood in a café, staring at a wet canvas propped against the wall. It was his own, a portrait of a man, the eyes shadowed, the face almost sculpted out of stone by the weight of paint. A woman in a silk dress walked past, paused, and whispered to her companion. "It feels like he painted not what the man looked like but what he was." Paul heard her. For the first time in months he smiled. But life in Paris was not all smiles. Poverty clung to him like a second skin. His father sent money reluctantly and Paul's temper, sharp, unpredictable, pushed friends away. He began to withdraw, painting alone, avoiding the salons that might have given him exposure. And yet, each failure seemed to drive him deeper into the work, as if he believed that if he could just solve the problem of seeing, everything else, money, respect, even love, would follow. That winter he returned to Aix for a visit, restless and frustrated. Zola greeted him warmly, but the streets felt too small now, the faces too predictable. On the third day Paul walked to the foot of Mont Saint-Victor. The air was sharp, smelling of pine and frost. He stood for hours, his breath turning to smoke in the cold, his eyes tracing the mountain's jagged edges. In that moment Cézanne knew, this mountain would be his life's companion. He would paint it not once, not twice, but over and over, until he could understand not only its shape but its soul. The mountain would change with every season, every hour, every breath of wind, and so would he. What he did not yet know was that his obsession would cost him almost everything, friends, love, even sanity, and yet give him immortality. Part 2. The Price of Seeing Differently. Paris, 1863. The city was boiling, not with heat but with change. Napoleon III had opened the Salon de Refuses to display works rejected by the official salon, and the air in Montmartre was thick with cigarette smoke, political arguments, and the smell of oil paint drying in cramped studios. In the cafés, artists spoke of freedom as if it were a religion. But for Cézanne, freedom came with a different name: Pissarro. Camille Pissarro was unlike anyone Paul had met. Calm where Paul was volatile, patient where Paul was impatient, Pissarro worked not to impress the critics but to capture the truth of a moment. He took the younger painter under his wing, teaching him to paint outside, en plein air. Cézanne's first attempts were clumsy, the colors heavy, the brushstroke stubborn. But something began to shift in him. Light stopped being an idea. It became a living thing. Still, Paris did not forgive easily. The Salon rejected Cézanne year after year. Critics sneered at his thick, awkward layers of paint, calling them mud and brutal smears. One review compared his portraits to rotting flesh on a butcher's slab. Each insult burned into him, but instead of softening his style to please them, he dug in deeper, layering the paint heavier, stripping away the decorative to reach the essential. It was in this period of artistic defiance that he met Hortense Fiquet, a young woman with a quiet smile and a patience rare enough to disarm him. She modeled for him in dimly lit rooms, sitting perfectly still as hours passed, the only sound the scratch of brush on canvas. Her presence calmed him. Her eyes never judged. They simply waited. But love, for Cézanne, was not a simple gift. He kept Hortense a secret from his father for nearly 17 years, terrified that any hint of romance would cut off his allowance and plunge them into total poverty. They lived quietly, almost invisibly, in small apartments and borrowed rooms, their lives bound by whispered conversations and the slow drying of paint. When their son, Paul Jr., was born in 1872, Cézanne felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years: fear, yes, but also urgency. He had a family now. He had to succeed, not just survive. Yet instead of chasing commissions or flattering patrons, he turned even more inward, obsessed with solving what he called the problem of form. He wanted solidity, permanence, paintings that could outlast flesh and memory. Pissarro persuaded him to join the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. For the first time, Cézanne's work was shown alongside Monet, Renoir, Degas. The result? Disaster. His landscapes were mocked as childish, his portraits as grotesque. The public laughed openly in front of his paintings. One critic wrote, "Monsieur Cézanne's works give the impression that he paints with a palette knife dipped in cement." The ridicule cut deep. Hortense urged him to ignore it, but Paul withdrew further, painting in near-complete isolation. He stopped showing at the Impressionist exhibitions, stopped courting the press. Even Zola, his old friend, began to drift away. When Zola's novel L'Oeuvre appeared in 1886, telling the tragic story of a failed painter, Cézanne recognized himself in the protagonist, and felt the betrayal like a knife. But that same year, something shifted in his personal life. His father, perhaps sensing the futility of resistance, finally relented and gave Paul financial independence. Cézanne married Hortense, quietly, without ceremony, and moved to the countryside near Aix. There, surrounded by olive trees, stone farmhouses, and the looming presence of Mont Sainte-Victoire, he began what would become the most productive and defining period of his life. In the small, light-filled studio he built himself, Cézanne painted like a man possessed. The mountain became his constant subject, sometimes bathed in gold morning light, sometimes cloaked in storm clouds, sometimes shimmering in the pale heat of summer. Each canvas was a battle between permanence and change, between the mountain's unyielding form and the shifting colors of the air around it. Yet isolation had its price. Hortense, bored and restless, spent long stretches away in Paris. Paul Jr. grew distant, seeing more of his mother than his father. Visitors to the studio described Cézanne as guarded, almost hostile, speaking little, painting constantly. And still Paris ignored him. The world moved on. Post-Impressionism was rising, new styles were capturing the critic's imagination, and Cézanne remained a stubborn outsider, an exile in his own century. It was not until the late 1890s, when he was already an old man by artistic standards, that younger painters began to whisper his name with reverence. Gauguin, Matisse, and especially Picasso would later call him the father of us all. But in those years, Cézanne himself remained unimpressed by fame. He still saw himself as a student, a man not yet finished with the mountain. One autumn afternoon, as the Mistral rattled the shutters and the scent of wet leaves filled the air, a visitor asked him why he kept painting Mont Sainte-Victoire after so many years. Cézanne's reply was simple: "Because I am beginning to understand it." And yet even then he knew he never fully would. Part 3, The Mountain That Would Not Let Go. By the dawn of the new century, Paul Cézanne was no longer a young man wrestling with Paris. His hair had thinned to wisps of gray, his beard was streaked with white, and his hands, though still steady, bore the marks of decades spent gripping brushes. But the fire, the obsession, had only sharpened. The world had begun to notice him at last. Exhibitions were organized in his honor. Critics who had once mocked him now called him a genius. But for Cézanne none of this mattered. Praise was as meaningless as ridicule. The only thing that mattered was the work. His studio in Aix-en-Provence had become a kind of monastery. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil clung to the air like incense. Along the walls, canvases leaned in silent ranks, some finished, some abandoned mid-stroke as if the mountain had turned its face away from him. The great wooden easel stood near the window, positioned to catch the shifting light of afternoon. From that window Mont Saint-Victor rose like an altar, its jagged silhouette cutting into the southern sky. In the mornings Cézanne would set out with his easel strapped to his back, climbing the dusty paths to find the right vantage point. Farmers watched him from the fields, shaking their heads at the strange old man who painted the same mountain over and over. Sometimes the Mistral would tear at his canvases, sending dust into the wet paint. Sometimes sudden rains would drench him, but still he painted. "I will die painting," he once said. That prophecy would prove truer than he knew. In October of 1906, Cézanne was caught in a sudden storm while painting outdoors. The sky darkened, the wind rose and sheets of rain fell, drenching him to the skin. He tried to keep working but the cold gnawed into his bones. By the time he returned home, shivering and weak, he had contracted pneumonia. Even then, bedridden and feverish, he kept a sketchpad beside him, his pencil moving in fits between coughs. On October 15th, he insisted on returning to the studio. Hortense, now more caretaker than muse, begged him to rest. He refused. The light, he said, was perfect that day. A few hours later he collapsed mid-session. Neighbors carried him back to the house but it was too late. 6 days later, on October 22, 1906, Paul Cézanne died at the age of 67. His funeral was a modest affair. Few of the Parisian critics who now hailed him as a master made the journey south. Hortense stood apart, her gloved hands trembling, while Paul Jr. stared at the coffin as if trying to reconcile the father he barely knew with the legend he had become. In the days after his death, the studio stood silent. Sunlight fell across the half-finished canvases. Brushes lay where he had left them. The final painting of Mont Saint-Victor, still wet, seemed to hum with the stubborn, unyielding energy of a man who had spent his life chasing the truth in color and form. Years later, Picasso would call Cézanne the father of us all. Matisse would speak of him as if speaking of a prophet. And yet Cézanne himself had never cared for titles. His legacy was not in the galleries, but in the way he had forced the eye to see differently. Perhaps that is why, on certain evenings, when the Mistral dies and the mountain glows in the last light of day, the people of Aix say they can still see him, an old man in a worn coat, brush in hand, staring at Mont Saint-Victor as if it still had one more secret to give. Epilogue: the silence after the brushstroke. The studio still breathes. Not in the way a living thing breathes, with lungs, with heartbeat, but with the memory of motion. Dust floats in the air like the ghosts of brushstrokes. A faint scent of turpentine lingers, stubborn as the man who once filled this space with his muttering, his sighs, his relentless demands of the canvas. The last light of day slants across the floorboards, turning them to ribbons of gold. It falls upon the easel, upon the half-finished Mont Saint-Victor, its forms vibrating with tension, its colors still alive though the hand that mixed them is long gone. There are no crowds here. No critics. No applause. Just the mountain and the man, though the man is now only in the paint. Some say Cézanne was never truly painting the mountain. They say he was painting the silence between the stones, the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. He was painting the weight of time, the way light can bend a shape into something holy. And perhaps, in the end, that is why the mountain never gave him all its secrets. Some truths are too vast for a single lifetime. The sun dips lower. Shadows deepen. In the stillness, it almost feels as if the door might open and the old man might shuffle in, grumbling about the light, reaching for his palette. But the only sound is the soft sigh of the wind through the open window. The painting remains. The mountain remains. And somewhere, in that impossible space between them, Paul Cézanne still stands, brush poised, forever on the edge of seeing.